What's up, everyone? They let us get to Friday again. That means it's time for another episode of the Leaf podcast. Let's hope this time there's not an error where it just cuts off 90% of what I'm saying. So, I have some pretty interesting stuff lined up, or I think it's interesting anyways. And to start us off, I have another story sent in by Mutant Buzzard. Mutant Buzzard is the one who sent in the story about the gentleman farmer, Pablo. He's also sent in stories in the past, such as Uncle Monkey's encounter with the Wendigo, and an encounter with the Hogman. And this one is really good too, so that's what we're going to get into first. Thank you, Mutant Buzzard, for sending in this story, and I hope I can do it justice. My brother always asked me, do you know what the difference is between a sea story and a fairy tale? Just before he told me. One starts out with Once Upon a Time, and the other starts out with This Is No Bull, and this ain't no bull every time he told me a sea story. This is a genuine no bull sea story that my brother told me about something weird that happened while he was a gunner's mate in the US Coast Guard. Really though, this story starts out in World War I when the US captured a German sailboat, Horstwessel, also known as Bark Eagle, a 295-foot, 90-meter bark that they gave to the Coast Guard Academy located in New London, Connecticut, that they used to train new cadets to be Coast Guard officers. The cadets get to sail the USCG Cutter Eagle all over the world and visit other nations with their own tall ships and long maritime histories to swap sea stories and biscuit recipes. The USCG Sea Eagle is the U.S. Coast Guard flagship, the pride and joy of New London, and the cadets keep it shipshape in Bristol fashion. Then, sometime in the 80s, after visiting the land down under on their way back to home port, it ran aground on some uncharted reef in the middle of bum nowhere in the Pacific Ocean. Now this was a major embarrassment for the Coast Guard for all the obvious reasons, so the brass ordered the USCGC Polar Sea, an icebreaker with the range to reach the marooned eagle and effect a rescue. The Polar Sea was supposed to be a 399-foot-long cutter, but at one time they backed down until it sounded expensive damaging a dock and putting a dimple in the Polar Sea's stern, so she was only 396 long, 3 feet shorter than her sister ship, the USCGC Polar Star. Anyway, when the Eagle ran aground, the cutter my brother was on was in dry dock, and the Polar Sea was short a gunner's mate, so he got a temporary duty assignment, or TDA, on the Polar Sea for the rescue mission. The Polar Sea got underway, full speed ahead, 18 knots, or about 20 miles per hour, heading out to the rescue when they got word over the squawk box that the Eagle had managed to float themselves off of the reef at high tide and were heading back to Sydney, Australia to effect any repairs. Now that the Polar Sea was no longer needed, it changed course for Guam to refuel and head back home to its port in Seattle, Washington. Then, one calm day before they got to Guam, the lookout spotted something strange floating in the water on the OOD, or officer on duty, cut the speed and backed down on the engine to slow the cutter down, maneuvering to the sluggish old girl close enough to the mysterious blob so that some of the crew members could poke it with a boat hook. When the cutter slowed down, everyone not on duty wanted to know why and flooded the main deck to get the scuttlebutt, just as the big red sea pig, as the crew lovingly referred to the Polar Sea, came to all stop with the unidentified blob just floating off the port side. It was a giant octopus. Its bulbous body was nearly as wide as the Polar Sea was at her beam, and a bit over half as long as the cutter's length, at almost 400 feet, with arms that made it even longer than the Polar Sea. The monster octopus wasn't moving. Seabirds were pecking at it, and it was missing at least one arm. My brother told me that they could see a stump of a lost limb as thick as a man's leg. The skin was sloughing off the giant octopus where it was above the surface, and the sun had dried it out. The beast certainly looked dead. But it wasn't. One of the deck apes heaved a monkey's fist heaving line that was normally used to dock the boat, They would tie the monkey's fist heaving line to the eye of the much heavier mooring lines, and then throw the monkeys onto the dock, where the longshoremen would use it to pull mooring lines ashore and drop the eye of the mooring line over a bollard on the pier, and then the deck apes would heave on the mooring lines and pull the ship into the dock. Anyway, the deck ape threw the monkey's fist over one of the octopus's arms, using it as a grappling hook, and dragged the giant arm to within reach of another one armed with a boat hook, a long wooden pole with a brass hook that was also used in line handling. The second deck ape used the boat hook to pull the monster octopus arm onto the deck, while some of the crew, the ones with cameras and the wits to use them, took pictures. In retrospect, pulling the sea monster's leg was the wrong thing to do because it wasn't dead, it just smelled that way. Someone had pulled out a knife and was going to cut the wrist-thick tentacle off for proof, but that was definitely the wrong thing to do because it must have felt the blade slice into its flesh, and it woke up, very much still alive and now really pissed off, as anyone would be if they were minding their own business, just chilling in the warm waters of the calm ocean, and then some jerk tries to cut your arm off. Would be, and had every right to be. The ocean erupted and attacked the hapless sailors on board. My brother told me how he used a firefighting axe to chop and hack his way through the giant tentacles to keep from being dragged overboard to a watery grave, just like in the movie 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and to get to the weapons locker where he busted out the M60 machine gun that he used Rambo style to single-handedly fight the monster off. What really happened, though, was as soon as they pulled the giant monster octopus's arm on deck, it woke up, farted out a giant ink cloud, and disappeared back into the deep. The ink cloud was estimated to be hundreds of yards long and wide. My brother said that he talked to the deck ape that pulled the monster's tentacle on board, and according to him, the tentacle had sucker cups the size of his palm. Before they pulled into Guam to refuel, the captain confiscated everyone's cameras and classified the whole incident as need to know, and ordered the crew not to blab about the Kraken, as the crew was calling it. I asked my brother why the captain would do that. He just shrugged and told me that officers are odd ducks. They do stuff like that because they are ambitious. The captain of the Polar Sea was pushing to make admiral, and probably didn't want to be known as the nut job that saw a giant octopus. Weird things like that on your record were frowned upon, and could and would be used against you by jealous rivals when it came time for promotions to be denied. But sailors everywhere love to tell and hear a good sea story, so classified or not, the story got out when they pulled into Guam to refuel for their trip home. So thank you to Mutant Buzzard for sending that story in. I hope I could do it justice. And now, next up, I'm going to talk about weird neighbors, I guess is the best word. We've all had really weird neighbors, and I'll tell a really crazy story about some after this whole thing. So this was originally written about in a book called Strange Intruders by David Weatherly, and then it's kind of retold in this article here, which I'll link down below. So this appears to have happened in the 2000s. The witness is only known as John. He's described as a retired computer engineer. He lived a very normal life in a very normal suburb. It was one of those cookie-cutter ones that was full of just regular working-class people. Now, this was in Dayton, Ohio as well. So there was a house that happened to be about 5 doors down from John. This house had been unoccupied for quite a while. However, as we know with any small community like this, I know from experience, rumors spread. The rumor was that the house was foreclosed on, and the previous owners had just totaled the inside. They went so far as to rip up the floors, tear down the walls, and smash the furniture. This is why that despite the low asking price that nobody moved in, because nobody wanted to have that problem as soon as they move in. Now after years and years, suddenly a family of 5 just appeared there. They just moved in one day. There had been no construction work or renovations done, as far as anyone could tell or knew about. They were just suddenly moving in one day, so they assumed that this new family was going to fix it themselves. Now, as you can imagine, with a new family moving in a small area, and then the family keeps to themselves like this one did, some odd rumors start popping up. One of them was from John's neighbor, one that was admittedly an unrelenting and unrepentant gossip hound. He said that he went to the neighbors to offer a business card for his plumbing business, and he had been met at the door by a dour-looking man that stood in such a way that he could not get a look into the house. Nevertheless, he was able to get a slight peek and was surprised that there was no furniture to be seen, just some dirty mattresses on the floor. The owner of the house had a decidedly creepy demeanor, merely staring at the card in the neighbor's hand as if it were a giant spider before saying that they did not need any plumbing work and then closed the door. Usually anytime anybody would see this family, they would be riding around in their kind of really shitty car. It was barely roadworthy apparently. People also took notice that the clothes that these people wore were raggedy and threadbare. This kind of would spark some rumors that they were down on their luck or extremely poor, and a reason like that would be why that they would move into a house like this. But then this kind of changed when one time the father of the family was seen at the grocery store. What this guy was doing is he was oddly walking up and down every single aisle almost methodically, and his cart was simply full to the brim with meat. Now, the neighbor who was trying to make a joke about it said, "Oh, you must be having a big barbecue." And then the man turned around and hissed, like an actual hiss, like an animal would do. And then the man simply stormed off to the checkout counter. Another weird rumor was that the mother of the family had been seen chasing a cat in her yard. While this may not seem out of the ordinary, apparently when she was doing this, her hair blew off like a wig, and it revealed a bald head that was scaly like a snake's. Only a couple people saw this before she was able to quickly replace the wig. Now, John's neighbor, who was the gossip hound, and his wife had at this point become basically obsessed with the new neighbors. In fact, the neighbor's wife said that they weren't right and that they were reptilians in disguise. John thought this was super stupid, until one day. He was out walking his dog and came across the man, the father of the family. He seemed to catch him by surprise. He tried to quickly go from his trash-filled car to his house. Not only did John's dog go berserk, but he also noticed that the man seemed to be wearing a toupee himself, and that there was skin beneath it, almost resembling scales. After this moment, John became fairly obsessed with the family himself, watching their house at all hours, reading all the articles he could about shape-shifting reptilians on the internet. This obviously took him to some pretty crazy conspiracy sites, but he truly believed what he had seen. And then another incident happened. A younger neighborhood boy went to this house to knock on the door and ask them if they wanted their lawn mowed, and the father refused, but the boy saw into the house, and he saw that the family was sitting at the table eating raw meat, and that their skin looked scaly. He also noticed the man's irises briefly became slits like those of a snake before reverting to normal. The boy was frightened by this, as anyone would be, and quickly went back home. After several more incidents that aren't really mentioned, this family suddenly one day just got into their car and drove off and never came back. They had totally evacuated the area, I guess is the proper word. Now, they lived there for about a year, and then one day they were just gone. And I believe after a time of being totally empty, they went to the house to try and see what's all going on in there, and they found that it was in a worse shape than it had been before. It was a total wreck now. There was garbage strewn about everywhere, It was like they had just been going to the bathroom right on the floor. There was rotting meat that was just sitting on the floor drawing flies. There were old mattresses with weird stains on them, allegedly, and as you can imagine, it would be gag-inducing. Now this is what John said when the family left. The neighborhood was not the same when those people lived there. Everyone seemed uneasy, and a lot of people had seen things that they couldn't explain. If they were human, they certainly weren't normal people. I still have a hard time bringing myself to accept that they were reptiles, but I can't deny how weird it all was. I'm just glad they went away, whatever they were. So what do you think? Do you think that the family were reptilians in human disguise? Or do you think that it was a whole neighborhood just schizoing out? But either way, you can't really deny the appearance of the people and the fact that there was just meat scattered on the floor, that they didn't seem to know how to use a restroom or use a fridge or anything like that. The whole situation is just really bizarre. And before I ended off, I said I had a weird story about neighbors, and yeah, it's pretty weird. So, an apartment building that I used to live in, and this is actually the same apartment where I mentioned some of the really scary stuff happening, and more happened than that too, but I'll get to that in a different video. Anyways, so it wasn't my neighbor, it was like an upstairs kind of neighbor, but like they also weren't on the same side of the building that I was on. They were across the hall from the people who were my upstairs neighbor. I hope I brought that across properly. So some nights we would hear fighting. Now I could never make out any words when this was going on. It sounded just like thuds and dragging and yelling. So we didn't know what the hell was going on. For a long time, we just said, well, it's not really my business. I'm very preoccupied with schooling and all that other stuff, so I just tried to ignore it. Not only that, but where my bedroom was, and I mentioned this before, was on the basement floor, so I didn't hear a lot of it whenever I was, in my room. But usually if I was up playing video games, which by this point was pretty frequently, I would hear it. So as this was all going on, I eventually asked my upstairs neighbor if it was him or not, and this is just one time that I happened to meet him on the front entrance by the stairs, and he looked a little weirded out. He was also a university student. He said it's not him. He said it was the apartment across the hall, and I said, well, I'm hearing it in my apartment. And he said along the lines of, no, you don't understand. It's not me. It's the apartment across the hall. And then he kind of looked up the stairs as if he was expecting someone to be watching him. He said that the apartment across the hall was empty, and that there was actually nobody in it, and that every night they would hear things moving around, they would hear yelling or just like bursts of a scream, and then nothing. And this would stop around 3 o'clock in the morning. In fact, I do remember one night when the police showed up and I had to let them in the building because the door was stuck or something like that. It was a weird building, I'm not gonna lie. Now, from my point of view, what I saw, or what I heard, I guess. So I'm up, sitting on this weird red couch that was left in our apartment by the previous tenants, and I'm playing Oblivion, like Elder Scrolls 4. And I think I was even doing a Dark Brotherhood quest, which is ironic. So I'm doing this quest, and then I hear like a whole bunch of commotion, and then I hear it stop. And then I hear someone banging on the outside door. I get up and I open the door because my door was actually right next to the outside door. And sometimes people would their key would stick, or the lock would freeze, because this was in the wintertime. And yeah, I had to let them in. So I went out, and there was 3 cops there. I opened the door. They asked if I called 911, and I said, no, I'm playing a video game. And it was kind of funny because I had the TV up a little bit louder because I couldn't hear what I was trying to do because of the noise upstairs. So I'm just standing there holding my big fluffy cat, and there's just the Oblivion music playing in the background, which is like kind of a calming medieval type of thing. I just thought that was kind of funny looking back. But anyways, I told them that they'll probably hear about the noise upstairs. So they go upstairs, and I stand in the hallway. I can hear them talking to the upstairs neighbor, and then I just go back into my apartment. And then I can hear them go across the hall. So now I'm curious. So I go back outside the apartment, stand in the hallway, and I hear them walk all through that apartment. And there's nobody in there. So what the hell was making the noise, It was just real weird, and I thought I would just kind of add that as my own personal paranormal story. This happened in 2014, I think. Yeah, it would have been 2014. It would have been just when it's kind of turning from winter to spring, but we're still getting some snowstorms. That's not really related. I just kind of wanted to get it all together in my head there. So I hope you enjoyed this episode of the podcast. And if you did, then please like and subscribe and comment and all that good stuff. And if you have a story of your own, feel free to send it to the email in the description and I will try to get back to you. And if you would like to donate to the channel, there's a PayPal and a Patreon in the description below that you can send it to if you'd like. Yeah, I'm getting all mixed up now. There's a PayPal and a Patreon in the description if you would like to donate to the channel, not send in your story there. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you Sunday. Thank you for pulling up a stump, and thank you for watching. Have a good weekend.